This presentation revolves around a topic called functional assessment. That is, imagine you're a counsellor. A couple visit you, concerned about the behaviour of their son, who is susceptible to major tantrums. Your role is to develop interventions that could prevent or resolve these traumas. Your first step is to conduct suitable assessments. In behavioural therapies, these assessments are called functional assessments. The reason is that during the assessment, you're trying to understand the function or evolution of undesirable behaviours, such as tantrums. Before I discuss how to conduct a functional assessment, I would recommend you watch the video in this link, at least for a minute or two. This video provides an excellent demonstration of the tantrums that some children might experience. We'll utilise this example to illustrate functional assessment. Now, this tantrum is quite pronounced. According to the description of this video, the child had subsequently been diagnosed with ADHD. The behaviour, therefore, cannot be ascribed to inappropriate parenting. Indeed, from a behavioural therapy perspective, the mother seems to behave quite appropriately. Nevertheless, the mother might have inadvertently expressed a few comments or enacted other behaviours, either during the tantrum or in the past, that could have fueled these tantrums. For example, some of the behaviours might have inadvertently reinforced this tantrum. The aim of functional assessment is to clarify the possible causes of undesirable behaviours such as tantrums, and then to change these behaviours. Specifically, the practitioner attempts to identify subtle rewards that could be reinforcing these undesirable behaviours. In addition, the practitioner attempts to clarify the antecedents or circumstances, that is the SDs, that could be provoking these undesirable behaviours. Now, to help identify these causes, practitioners need to appreciate the vast range of reinforcers that could be inspiring these behaviours. To achieve this goal, practitioners should be aware that reinforcers can be divided into 4 distinct categories: social positive reinforcers, social negative reinforcers, automatic positive reinforcers, and automatic negative reinforcers. To illustrate, social positive reinforcers refer to occasions in which another person, such as a parent, dispenses something that is perceived as pleasant. In the example in which the child was experiencing a tantrum, the mother did smile and laugh, albeit nervously, a few times, and this smile and laughter might have reinforced the tantrum. Because someone else has dispensed something positive, we refer to this reinforcement as social positive. Even yelling at a child can be a social positive reinforcer because the child might have enjoyed the attention or the sense of control they experience over their parents. Second, social negative reinforcers refer to occasions in which another person, such as a parent, withdraws something that is perceived as unpleasant. In this example, the child might not want to be alone in the back seat. In response to the tantrum, the mother is refusing to withdraw from the child. Because something else has withdrawn something negative, in this instance the prospect of sitting alone in the back seat, we refer to this reinforcement as social negative. Third, automatic positive reinforcers refers to occasions in which the behaviour itself elicits something pleasant. In this example, when the child screams, he feels a rush of air down his windpipe. The rush of air might feel soothing. Because the behaviour elicits a pleasant feeling, we refer to this reinforcement as automatic positive. And finally, automatic negative reinforcers refer to occasions in which the behaviour itself prevents something unpleasant. In this example, the child may not like the sound of traffic. However, when he screams, he can't hear the traffic. So, because the behaviour prevents something unpleasant, like the sound of traffic, we refer to this reinforcement as automatic negative. In short, the social reinforcers are initiated by someone else, like a parent or teacher. The automatic reinforcers are inherent in the behaviour. The positive reinforcers entail something pleasant, whereas the negative reinforcers elicit or entail withdrawing something unpleasant. And if practitioners understand these categories of reinforcers, they can more readily uncover the subtle reinforcers that could be inadvertently inspiring some behaviour, such as tantrums. So how do we identify these reinforcers? Well, practitioners tend to apply two broad approaches: direct methods and indirect methods. Now, direct methods merely involve observing the child directly. And in contrast, indirect methods don't involve observing the child directly, but other alternatives such as interviewing parents and teachers or administering standardised questionnaires. Now, the first phase of functional assessment is typically to begin with indirect methods, such as interviews. So to illustrate, consider the young boy who was experiencing the tantrum before. I'll present a series of questions you could ask the parents, teachers, or other relevant figures. And your role is to categorise these questions into two clusters. In addition, you could pretend to answer these questions about someone you know who is susceptible to tantrums. So here are the questions. In which locations does the child tend to experience tantrums? And in which locations is he unlikely to experience tantrums? And after he experiences a tantrum, how do you tend to react? Who is usually nearby when he tends to experience a tantrum? And is he less likely to experience a tantrum more with certain people than other people? And how do other people tend to react in response to his tantrums? And do you feel that he's more likely or less likely to experience tantrums at particular times of the day or days of the week? How do his siblings react in response to his tantrums? And finally, in what circumstances is he more likely to experience tantrums, such as when he's feeling shy or when he's playing? So you may have realised these questions can be divided into two clusters. And the first cluster can be summarised by the following question: when, where, with whom, and in what circumstances is the behaviour most or least likely? And these questions clarify the antecedents, or SD, that tends to provoke the undesirable behaviour and desirable alternatives. The second cluster can be summarised by this question: what happens from you, other people and so forth if the child does or does not engage in the behaviour? And these questions clarify the reinforcers, that is, the responses from other people that could be reinforcing the undesirable behaviour. And indirect methods such as interviews can garner information rapidly and efficiently. Nevertheless, the answers to these questions are not always entirely accurate. That is, a variety of biases may contaminate the answers of parents, teachers, and other individuals. So let me illustrate some of these biases. First, parents and teachers are susceptible to the illusion of control. For example, like everyone else, when playing board games, they would prefer to roll a dice themselves than permit someone else to roll the dice. That is, they feel they can somehow influence an outcome they can't actually control. For a similar reason, some parents or teachers may overestimate the likelihood that they can influence the behaviour of their children. They might therefore overestimate the degree to which their decisions affect these behaviours. They may erroneously, for example, ascribe the tantrums of their children to their own behaviour. In addition, parents may be susceptible to the IKEA effect. That is, like everyone, parents tend to overestimate the quality of something that they constructed themselves. They might prefer a table they constructed, even if they merely followed instructions, than a table they didn't construct. Likewise, parents tend to construct their children, admittedly not with instructions from IKEA, but they do contribute to the development of their child. Hence, they might overestimate the qualities of their children. They might therefore overestimate the degree to which their child was provoked, to ascribe tantrums to these provocations, rather than to more enduring problems in their child. Furthermore, parents might be susceptible to the status quo bias. That is, like everyone, parents and teachers tend to believe that existing practices are better than alternative practices. For example, in one study, participants were asked to indicate their attitudes towards various policies, such as whether prostitution should be legal or whether people should be permitted to feed alley cats. And in general, participants preferred whatever they believed was the current policy over alternative policies. And for this reason, parents and teachers often prefer their existing parental practices over alternative practices. They are therefore sometimes reluctant to ascribe the tantrums of their children to their own entrenched behaviours. Besides such biases, parents and teachers might simply forget the antecedents or circumstances that precede tantrums. During a tantrum, some parents or teachers experience high levels of stress, a feeling that increases levels of cortisol in the bloodstream. And this cortisol can actually impair the consolidation of memories. So parents and teachers might literally forget the precise details that preceded some undesirable behaviour, such as a tantrum. Now, second, after conducting these interviews, the practitioner will now generate provisional hypotheses. The hypothesis will include two facets. First, the hypothesis might specify the antecedents or circumstances that tend to provoke the undesirable behaviour. You might hypothesise, for example, the child tends to experience tantrums in the morning in unfamiliar locations when he's hungry. Now, second, the hypothesis might specify the reinforcers that could be inciting or encouraging these undesirable behaviours. You might hypothesise that attention from onlookers or the tendency of parents to cancel unfamiliar events, like driving to an unfamiliar location, could be reinforcing these tantrums inadvertently. Now, third, practitioners are then ready to observe the child, primarily to test these hypotheses. Now, generally, the practitioner will want to observe the child in a range of settings, completing a variety of tasks. And while watching the child, the practitioner will typically use one of three methods to record their observations: the description method, the checklist method, and the interval method. So to understand this material, I'd like you to watch some people, maybe at a cafe or some other public place. And your task is to identify the antecedents of their body language, as well as some possible reinforcers of this body language. So the first method, description, merely involves describing the antecedents, features, and consequences of a specific behaviour. In particular, create a table with 3 columns. Label the columns before, during, and after. And as soon as someone demonstrates some body language, in the column labelled before, first describe the events that preceded this action. You might write something like, the other person shouted, or the other person laughed. And this column thus represents the antecedent, or SD, discriminative stimulus. Next, in the column labelled during, describe the body language, that is, describe the relevant action. You might write something like, the person shrugged her shoulders. And this column thus represents the behaviour. And finally, in the column labelled after, describe the response to this body language. You might write something like, the other person stopped yelling. And this column thus represents the consequence, a consequence that could be a potential reinforcer. Now, if you can, apply this method to some people you're observing. Now, the second method utilised to record observations is called the checklist technique. And this method is similar, except that in response to a behaviour, the practitioner ticks possible options. So to illustrate, the column labelled before could actually be divided into several subcolumns, each corresponding to a possible antecedent. The subcolumns, for example, could be labelled other person is negative, other person is positive, nobody's speaking, both people are speaking, and so forth. Likewise, the column labelled during could also include several subcolumns, each corresponding to a different possible undesirable behaviour. The subcolumns, for example, could be labelled person shrugs shoulder, person folds arm, and person touches face. Finally, the column labelled after could also include several subcolumns, each corresponding to a possible consequence. These subcolumns, for example, could be labelled other person laughs, other person stops talking, other person scowls, and so forth. Each row corresponds to one behaviour. For example, suppose that nobody's speaking, then one person shrugs her shoulders, and finally the other person laughs. So in one row, you would tick the corresponding options. Now typically, practitioners would apply the checklist technique after they have implemented the previous description method for a while. Otherwise, they'd not be certain how to label the various subcolumns. That is, they would not be informed about the possible antecedents, behaviours and consequences. So now, if you like, apply this method to some people you're observing. Now, the third and final method utilised to record observations is called the interval method. And this method is similar to the previous checklist technique. However, with a checklist technique, each row represents one behaviour. But with the interval technique, each row represents all the antecedents, behaviours and consequences that were observed during a particular interval, such as maybe 1 minute from 3:15 p.m. to 3:16 p.m. And hence, when this method is applied, more ticks are likely to appear in each row. Thus, when the interval method is applied, the practitioner records all the antecedents, behaviours and consequences observed during a particular interval. When the other techniques are applied, the practitioner records information only in response to a specific behaviour, such as a shoulder shrug. So what are the benefits and drawbacks of each method? Well, the first, or description method, actually demands considerable effort because the person has to record all the behaviours, but does enable practitioners to record a greater range of behaviours and subtleties. The second, or checklist method, demands only moderate levels of effort, provided the columns have been created thoughtfully. And the third, or interval method, actually demands even less effort because the practitioner only needs to record information during specific intervals. If the practitioners feel fatigued, for example, they can arrange longer rests between these intervals. So far we've assumed the practitioner merely observes the behaviour, but with a technique called functional analysis, sometimes referred to as the experimental method, the practitioners don't merely observe the behaviour. Instead, the practitioners actually manipulate or change the environment in some way. Now, before discussing this approach, I'd like to present pairs of words or names that are often confused. So, for example, people often confuse James Earl Jones, the actor, who, for example, was the voice of Darth Vader, with James Earl Ray, who was actually the assassin of Martin Luther King Jr. Indeed, during a parade in Florida, organisers had intended to construct the sign, "Thanks James Earl Jones for keeping the dream alive," but instead created the sign, "Thanks James Earl Ray for keeping the dream alive," inadvertently celebrating the assassin. People also confuse Grenada, a Caribbean nation spelled Grenada, with Granada, a province in Spain spelled Granada. And one man even accidentally bought a ticket to the Caribbean nation when he intended to visit Spain. And finally, as a child, I tended to confuse prosecute with execute. So when I read a sign in the park with the words, "Trespassers will be prosecuted," I was just terrified that I might be hung or shot. Likewise, people sometimes confuse functional assessment with functional analysis. Now, functional assessment is the overall behavioural assessment, whereas functional analysis is just a part of functional assessment, a part that is also called the experimental method. So in essence, when practitioners conduct functional analysis or the experimental method, they manipulate antecedents or reinforcements to assess their hypothesis. So, for example, suppose the practitioner wants to assess the hypothesis that unfamiliar odours elicit tantrums in the child. So the practitioner could then observe the behaviour of this child in response to unfamiliar and familiar odours. And if the child seems calmer in response to familiar odours, the hypothesis is supported. Likewise, suppose the practitioner wants to assess the hypothesis that smiles from the parent reinforce the tantrum. Now, the practitioner could then ask the mother to smile one week, but then scale or frown another week after the child experiences a tantrum. And if the child seems calmer after the mother frowns, the hypothesis is supported. Otherwise, the hypothesis would need to be refined and tested again. So in conclusion, to implement functional assessment overall, the practitioner will first typically interview the parents and perhaps other relevant authorities. Next, the practitioner will generate hypotheses about the likely antecedents of this undesirable behaviour and the consequences that could be reinforcing this behaviour. Then the practitioner might observe the child directly and may update the hypothesis as a consequence. And the practitioner might continue to test these hypotheses, perhaps with functional analysis or the experimental method. And finally, once the assessment is complete, the practitioner will design an intervention, and the intervention is designed to remove the antecedents that might be provoking the behaviour, and to remove the consequences that might be reinforcing the behaviour. So in this example, the practitioner might encourage the parents to minimise exposure to unfamiliar odours, especially when the child's upset, and maybe to abstain from smiling during a tantrum. And the intervention might thus include extinction, manipulation of antecedents, as well as differential reinforcement and other techniques as well.